Picture this. We are dropping right back into the year 2016. At the time, this was supposed to be the absolute crowning moment for Brazil as a major global superpower. I mean, their industries were growing at some of the fastest rates anywhere in the world. They had just overtaken India and Italy in pure economic output, and they were breathing right down the necks of France and the UK. Literally everything, life expectancy, average incomes, global influence, was trending up. But today, in this explainer, we're going to unpack what really happened. We're going to dive into the spectacular rise, the sudden staggering fall, and the potential rebirth of this massive South American powerhouse.
To really understand how quickly the narrative shifted, you just have to look at the 2016 Rio Olympics. This event was meant to be the ultimate glitzy victory lap for Brazil's success story. But the reality? It was kind of a global embarrassment. Instead of a showcase of a booming superpower, facilities were barely slapped together in time, brand new arenas were surrounded by waste, the sheer cost of the games essentially bankrupted the city of Rio, and the public servants needed to actually run the event. They were on strike because they literally weren't getting paid. If this was Brazil putting its best foot forward, well, something was deeply, deeply broken behind the scenes.
Section 1. Slaying 1990s hyperinflation.
Okay, to truly grasp Brazil's modern economy, we actually need to flash back to the early 90s, because this country built its economic engine out of absolute chaos. Back then, Brazil was dealing with a monster of a problem, hyperinflation. And we aren't talking about prices creeping up a few percent a year. We are talking about inflation hitting a mind-numbing 84% in a single month. One of the biggest culprits driving this madness was a wage price spiral, fueled by a specific Brazilian policy called indexation. Normally, a wage price spiral is a nasty loop where wages go up, so businesses raise prices to cover costs, which makes workers demand higher wages again. But Brazil's indexation system actually automated this whole thing. It automatically bumped up people's paychecks to match inflation, which forced businesses to instantly hike prices, which then automatically pushed wages right back up. Banning this automated system sounded incredibly harsh to the working class at the time, but it was a painful, absolute necessity to finally break the cycle.
That ban was the crucial first step. It eventually paved the way for the government to introduce the Plano Real in 1994, which gave birth to a brand new currency, the real. Now, to give you a sense of just how completely destroyed the earlier currencies were, if you took one modern real and traded it backwards through all the failed currencies that came before it, it would be equivalent to 2.75 quintillion original reals. That is a completely absurd number. To get the public to actually believe that stability was possible this time around, the government had to roll out some really brutal price freezes and start privatizing massive, inefficient industries.
Section 2. The 2000s commodity boom. So, heading into the 2000s, the stage is perfectly set. Brazil suddenly has a stable currency, leaner privatized industries, and a massive hungry workforce of 108.4 million people. This kicked off a legendary economic run that transformed them from a politically unstable developing nation into an absolute heavyweight export powerhouse in less than 10 years. But the real spark for this boom, it wasn't actually domestic policy. It was international demand, specifically China. As China was rapidly industrializing, they rolled out a colossal economic stimulus plan worth $586 billion. All that money was pumped into a massive, unprecedented building spree. And to build, China desperately needed raw materials, iron ore, bauxite, lumber, and Brazil, sitting on a treasure trove of natural resources, had exactly what China's insatiable appetite was demanding.
This leads us to a really fascinating dynamic. When the rest of the world completely panicked during the 2007 and 2008 global financial crisis, Brazil barely even flinched. Seriously, while the banking sectors in the US and Europe were absolutely imploding, Brazil's economy only dipped by 2.9% in the last quarter of 2008 and a mere 0.9% in early 2009 before zooming right back to strong growth. How did they pull that off? Well, they were insulated. Their economy relied heavily on exporting basic raw materials to a still-growing China, and their domestic financial sector was honestly just too basic to get tangled up in the complex, toxic assets that were destroying Western banks. And right in the middle of this massive export boom, Brazil essentially won the lottery. In 2007, they discovered the Tupi pre-salt oil field right off their coast. 8 billion. That staggering number represents the recoverable barrels of oil found in that single discovery. It was the largest newly discovered hydrocarbon source in the entire Western Hemisphere. Between the wealth on their land and the wealth in the sea, Brazil had an endless cornucopia of resources. But, okay, this leaves us with a massive, glaring contradiction.
Think about it. If a country successfully rides out the world's largest economic crisis completely unscathed, is armed with a 108 million person workforce, possesses endless land resources, and just found 8 billion barrels of offshore oil, how on earth does it suddenly collapse into chaos by 2016? What actually caused the crash?
Section 3. Operation Car Wash triggers collapse.
Let's jump ahead to 2014. This is where we see the beginnings of what would become modern history's largest Western political scandal. It all started with this tiny, incredibly mundane investigation into money laundering at a local gas station and car wash. The agents making the arrests honestly figured the suspect would just pay a fine and be out by morning. Instead, turning over that single stone exposed a sprawling, unbelievably dark network of corruption. They called it Operation Car Wash. The initial shockwave revealed that $43 million had been siphoned directly from taxpayer wallets in a massive cash-for-vote scheme. And the worst part? It was all tied directly to the state oil giant, Petrobras. This was the exact same company foreign investors had been desperately clamoring to work with. It was the undisputed crown jewel of Brazil's economy.
But of course, it didn't stop at 43 million. The scale widened aggressively. It was later alleged that a mind-blowing $2.1 billion was redistributed in this scheme. This money lined the pockets of scheme operators and financed the political campaigns of dozens of high-level politicians. This massive network of embezzlement was defrauding Petrobras on contracts that were specifically designed to develop those exact same pre-salt oil reserves we just talked about.
The fallout from this was immediate and completely catastrophic. Watching a seemingly endless slew of corruption cases flood the evening news night after night totally shattered both domestic and international confidence. The loss of faith in Petrobras was so incredibly severe that this single scandal dropped Brazil's total GDP by 0.75% in 2015. Just let that sink in. One company's scandal shrinking an entire nation's economy.
Section 4. Geography and the brain drain.
To make matters infinitely worse, this massive domestic implosion perfectly coincided with a global drop in commodity prices. And this exposed a severe physical vulnerability for Brazil, something they couldn't just legislate their way out of. Look at Brazil's main competitors, right? Countries like Canada, Australia, and Russia. When they export to Asia, they mostly have relatively direct, efficient sea routes. Brazil, on the other hand, is geographically isolated. They have to ship their goods either through the notoriously dangerous Drake Passage at the bottom of South America or pay the massive tolls to go through the Panama Canal. When global commodity prices were sky-high, no one cared about these extra transport expenses. But when prices crashed, Brazil's profit margins totally vanished, meaning their resources were the very first to get cut from global orders.
Furthermore, just getting those resources out of the ground domestically is punishingly expensive. Hauling raw materials across the flat deserts of Australia? That's relatively cheap. Trying to move them through the dense, unforgiving Amazon rainforest? It is an absolute logistical nightmare. And whenever the Brazilian government tries to clear paths through the Amazon to make shipping cheaper, it instantly invites severe global backlash. At one point, the European Union even stalled major trade relations specifically over concerns about Amazon deforestation. It's a complete catch-22. So you have falling exports, collapsing local industries, a plummeting currency, and massive political scandals. The human cost of all this became devastating. We saw the rise of the Brazilian diaspora. Investment in science and research absolutely plummeted, meaning cutting-edge researchers suddenly had zero resources. So what do? They leave. There's been a 321% increase in Brazilian immigration to China and a 175% increase to neighboring Paraguay. It is a massive brain drain. Highly qualified professionals are fleeing, which means Brazil is losing the exact problem solvers it desperately needs to navigate its way out of this crisis.
Section 5. The path to rebound.
So, facing the flight of foreign investors, an exodus of their most skilled workers, and a population that is rightfully furious about political instability, is Brazil just out of luck? Surprisingly, no. A powerful rebound is entirely possible because the underlying reality hasn't changed one bit. Brazil still possesses boundless natural resources. One masterful move they are making on the global chessboard right now to leverage those resources is utilizing their role in the BRICS organization. This geopolitical strategy is brilliant for a few key reasons. First, it secures their trade position with China, who remains their biggest customer. Second, by promoting a bit of mutual irritation among global rivals, it forces other major powers to actively compete for Brazil's favor. For instance, the United States desperately needs raw materials for its own infrastructure goals and absolutely does not want rivals threatening its economic dominance in the Americas. This dynamic gives Brazil major leverage to negotiate highly favorable trade deals.
And as the global economy has started to stabilize post-pandemic, Brazil's growth is actually returning. Now, it might be slower than those dizzy and chaotic heights of the early 2000s, but here's the thing. Slow and stable economic growth is vastly superior. What Brazil urgently needs right now is to break free from the catastrophic whiplash of huge, euphoric booms, inevitably followed by devastating, scandalous busts.
Which brings us to our final question for this explainer. Brazil has undoubtedly been battered by political deception and economic mismanagement. But remember, this is also a country that conquered 84% monthly hyperinflation and built world-class industries out of thin air. There is absolutely no reason they cannot create an environment that tempts the brightest minds back home and charts a new, stable course for the future. So, will Brazil finally harness that immense potential for the long haul, or are they doomed to let history simply repeat itself? It's a fascinating, high-stakes balancing act, and it's one we will undoubtedly be watching very closely.